Hey, it's me, your gal, Militant Empathy. If you've been here before, welcome back. It's good to see you again. If you're new here, strap the fuck in, because this month we're going to be talking about the history of agrarian reform. No, I am kidding. This month we're going to be talking about the police. So for any newcomers, this is a show where I take a different topic each episode and I pick it apart from a variety of angles. Not to give too much away, but I have or will be, depending on what order you're listening to the episodes in, covered topics like community and community breakdown, mental health, the meaning of justice, the history of borders, and the social construction of sex. You can find any of the episodes on all major podcasting platforms and also on YouTube. And you can find additional materials, and by that I mean, yes, the sources, but crucially the accompanying memes on my Instagram, which is @MilitantEmpathy. So this month we're going to be covering the police. So a bit of housekeeping before we get started. This episode is going to cover themes of police brutality, sexism, racism, and classism. If you think that's just not the vibe for you today, that's absolutely fair. Just switch over or maybe go back and listen to an earlier episode, which I'll be totally honest, I can't promise will be any lighter, but will maybe just bring a different flavor of dread to your day. So for regular listeners of the show, you'll know I usually like to start with a bit of history, call it a kink, call it a disturbing, obsessive pathology, whatever you like. It just sort of gets me going. And today I want to start by talking about a crucial bit of cultural history, the track Fuck the Police by NWA, which was released in 1988 as part of their debut album, Straight Outta Compton. Now, I'm not going to actually play the track because I am, quite frankly, too poor for the copyright. Side note, this is a great time to mention the Patreon. So if you like the show and you'd like to support us with money, find us on patreon.com/militantempathy. But yeah, back to NWA. So let's set the scene a little bit. So in the United States in 1988, President Ronald Reagan was in the final year of his second term, meaning that many of the legacies of his presidency were already fully in place. Amongst these, the massive expansion of both the American police and military through enormous increases in both their funding and personnel, an apparently irreversible level of meat riding for neoliberal economic policy, which basically meant tax cuts for the rich while slashing both social supports and the regulation of markets for everyone else. And finally, the crown jewel, a full throttle embrace of the war on drugs. So the term, the war on drugs, was actually coined by Reagan's predecessor, President Richard Nixon, in the 1970s in response to drug taking both within the hippie counterculture and the massive prevalence of opiate addiction amongst returning soldiers from the war in Vietnam. But by the 1980s, it had taken on a new meaning, owing largely to the emergence of crack cocaine within predominantly poor and black neighborhoods. So we can hear links to this historical context in the NWA track in Ice Cube's first verse when he says, and I'm going to, blank out the racial slur here because, spoiler, I am not black. He says, fucking with me because I'm a teenager with a little bit of gold in a pager, searching my car, looking for the product, thinking every is selling narcotics. Which I think speaks to two things, right? Firstly, it clearly shows that by the 1980s, stereotypes of drug use and particularly drug dealing had become heavily racialized and associated with young black men. Secondly, it speaks to the white supremacy of the American economy, wherein any black person with visible displays of wealth was assumed to be involved in criminality, in a way kind of implicitly recognizing the exclusion of black people from the formal American economy. So this is a theme that we hear in a lot of other American hip-hop tracks, from classics like Sound of the Police by KRS-One to modern hits like Childish Gambino's This Is America. The underlying class and status envy motivating white police officers to harass young black men and to attempt to, quote unquote, keep them in their place. So how did we get there? How did we get to the point that Eazy-E's claiming that the police would rather see me in the pen than see me and Lorenzo rolling in a benzo? Well, the argument I'm going to lay out here is that this was in many ways inevitable, because the police were designed to uphold the structure of inequality and protect the interests of racial, sexual, and economic elites, and they have done so consistently throughout history. So let's take it back now to England in the 1700s. Before the creation of professional modern police forces, much of policing was organised around a kind of ad hoc system of private constables. So back in ye olden days, each town parish would elect via their parish assembly, wherein, only the richest taxpayers were represented. We can already kind of see where this is going, right? A constable to oversee the kind of pseudo-law enforcement that happened at that time. And they would be in charge of things like arresting and searching those suspected of felony crimes covered by the quarter sessions, which was just a kind of court, which included mainly property crimes like robbery, burglary, and most theft, breaking up village brawls, and maintaining an accurate record of the townsfolk liable to serve in the militia. So already we can pick up on a couple of things here that show how policing was designed to protect the interests of the economic elite. First off, the people who got to choose who was in charge of policing were the upper class. And the person elected to be constable for that year would also typically be at least middle class, because it was thought that in order to be an independent figure, they would need to, quote, not be the servant of any other man, meaning that they would typically have to themselves be some kind of property owner. Thirdly, in terms of their actual responsibilities, we can see that much of the constable's jobs was to protect the economic interests of the elite. So by keeping a record of the townsfolk liable to serve in the militia, they are protecting the interests literally of the ruling classes, who need to ensure that they have able bodies they can call upon to fight their wars. Wars that would have been distinctly imperial in nature at this time, although arguably all wars are in some way. Additionally, by searching and arresting people suspected of committing property crimes, they are protecting the interests of the propertied classes, who would have been the minority at this time. And you might say, hey, maybe they were also helping protect what little property the lower classes had too. Maybe they got involved in disputes around withheld earnings, etc. And to this I say we have to look at how they were paid. So the role of constable was essentially a voluntary position. Constables were able to claim back expenses incurred during their work from the town parish and some fees from the courts on whose behalf they acted, but their main bread and butter was actually in private fees. So these 18th century constables were essentially closer to private detectives than they were civil servants. Most of their earnings typically came from private prosecutions. So private prosecutions are an anomaly of the British legal system and some other common law systems like Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, wherein a private individual can mount a criminal prosecution in court against another private individual. So the state is not the one deciding who to prosecute, it is the citizens who are mounting their own prosecution. But this process is very expensive, and you could only really expect to recover your costs if your prosecution was successful, which has meant that historically, the private prosecution system has only really been accessible to the very wealthy or those with some kind of organizational backing. So constables were able to make money off of private prosecutions by charging fees for doing things like appearing in court as a witness or for expenses entailed in recovering stolen property. So whilst constables were, in theory, also entrusted with the protection of property for the working classes, in practice, they focus primarily on the private prosecutions brought by the rich because these are the people who could pay them. By the 1820s, though, some 40 years prior to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, which was definitely accurately and historically depicted in cinematic classic National Treasure 2, Book of Secrets. By the 1820s, the nature of society is changing, and this system of private constables is in need of reform in order to keep protecting the interests of the elite. So the main shifts were in the rise of urbanization and industrialization. So whereas before society had been structured around this kind of patchwork of semi-rural towns and smaller cities where a lot of the labor is agrarian based. We are actually kind of doing a kind of history of agrarian reform here. By this point, we're really starting to see the rise of big cities and factory labor. So the reason that factory labor was so substantively different is because it was a much more organized form of labor with larger workforces where the workers are working and also living in much closer contact with each other. So what do we get at this time? That's right, we get the rise of trade unionism and civil protest. So because of this, we get things like the Peterloo Massacre of 1819, where 60,000 workers had gathered in central Manchester to demand, amongst other things, the right to vote, and were then violently, quote-unquote, dispersed by the town militia, leading to the deaths of an estimated 18 people and the injury of several hundred more. This was obviously very alarming to elites. Another thing that was alarming was the rise of so-called volume crime. So this referred to a phenomena where the individually more lucrative but also more patchwork system of like highway robberies that had predominated in the 18th century came to be replaced by a much more pervasive system of minor thefts and daylight robberies. So things like street muggings by groups of working class men in cities. The issue presented by volume crime and trade unionism for traditional policing was that the old constabulary system lacked the central organization and oversight to effectively address these larger scale threats. So under the old system, constables were more or less like free to get on with things as they saw fit. Essentially, the problem was that whilst a patchwork system of individual free agent constables was suitable for addressing property crimes against the rich, when it was also primarily made up of a patchwork of highway robberies, and able to more or less like keep the poor in check when they weren't so heavily concentrated within large cities, this system could not provide the level of social control needed to address the more ubiquitous phenomenon of volume crime and the more organized phenomenon of 19th century trade unionism and civil protest. So, where were the pre-existing examples of this kind of social control that police reformers in England could pull on? That's right, it's the fucking colonies. So that's like 10 minutes in before we even mention colonialism. I think that might be some new record, gold stars all round. But anyway, back to the 1820s. So what happens is that the police, once composed of this like middle class free agent constabulary model, is submitted to what historian Chris Williams has called a process of proletarianization, i.e. they come to look more like the modern industrial labor force that they are being deployed to control, with management structures, strict oversight, and set wages. This new reformed model of policing looked a lot more like the models of social control already operational in the colonies, where the agents of social control were also closer to the proletariat or working class than the middle class. Now, traditionally, historians have argued that the London Metropolitan Police, which was founded in 1829, was the first modern police force, and that this model was then the blueprint for other modernizing police forces, notably in the United States. However, I'm going to argue that the reverse actually happened. The Met was not the blueprint for policing in the colonies, rather policing in the colonies was the blueprint for the Met. So the divide and rule strategy of social control eventually deployed by the new Metropolitan Police in the mid-1800s was actually first developed and perfected in the slave colonies of the Americas and the Caribbean. The reconceptualization of the police as an organized paramilitary force originated not with the creation of the so-called Bobby, but with the colonization of Ireland and the creation of the ironically named Peace Preservation Force in 1814. The links between these historical injustices and the Met are not just about similarities in form. They don't just look like they might have influenced each other. It's not just that they have like a similar vibe. Rather, I'm going to show you how two of the key reformers involved in actually creating the Met were also directly involved in these processes of colonization. So let's take this chronologically and go to the example of plantation slave societies first. So it's estimated that somewhere between 12 and 12.8 million Africans were enslaved as part of the transatlantic slave trade between the 1600s and the 1800s. Now, obviously, this is just like a really enormous number of people, right? And whilst about 10 to 15% of these would have actually died en route to the colonies due to the deadly conditions aboard the slave ships, the end result was still that white colonizers in the Americas and the Caribbean very quickly became a racial minority. For example, by the 1700s, many Caribbean colonies were between 70 and 90% Black. And in order to maintain stringent social control over what was essentially the vast majority of the population, particularly once poor whites were factored into the mix as a subpopulation to be controlled, two key institutions emerged. First, the slave patrol, and second, the plantation overseer. So the slave patrol system was fairly straightforward. Patrols served two purposes: to prevent revolts and to hunt down fugitive slaves. But the crucial element underpinning the patrol system were the slave codes, which were sets of laws established in colonies in the mid-1600s, and they set about like the specific terms of enslavement. So they were essentially kind of like the rules of how slavery worked. And these slave codes pretty much universally across slave societies in the Americas and the Caribbean decreed that enslaved people had no freedom of movement. In practice, this meant that enslaved people were not allowed to leave the plantation without a note from their master, mistress, or overseer, which from a surveillance point of view was very important because it made any enslaved person off the plantation a de facto source of suspicion and created a kind of hypervigilance around the movements of enslaved people that helped to prevent populations from different plantations banding together in revolt, which was kind of like the worst nightmare of the white ruling class, right? They had an acute awareness that whilst an uprising of enslaved people from a single plantation would be more or less easily suppressed by the town militia, if the enslaved population of multiple plantations banded together at the same time, they would very quickly be overrun. Essentially, the slave patrols operated on a classic divide and conquer logic. Their efficacy was almost completely dependent on securing this first step of keeping enslaved labor forces of different plantations totally separate, totally divided. But even further, by decreeing that black enslaved people had no freedom of movement, the slave code served to, in effect, deputize all white men, both rich and poor, as members of the slave patrol. This was actually explicitly stated in a 1688 revision to the Slave Code of Barbados, which specified that all black people were to travel with a pass from their masters and that any and all white men were to whip and detain any and all black persons traveling without such papers. So this revision to the Slave Code of Barbados then became something of a blueprint for other slave colonies, with the South Carolina Assembly copying 3/4 and the full preamble of the Barbados revision in their own revised Slave Code of 1696. In this sense, the slave patrol system also served a second purpose: to divide and conquer the white working class. By effectively deputizing all white men into the patrol, it helped as an institution to create racial solidarity amongst the white population, both rich and poor, who were persuaded to define public order by the extent to which black bodies could effectively be subjugated and controlled. The role of the plantation overseer fulfilled a similar ideological function. So they were responsible for directing or overseeing the daily work of enslaved Africans on the plantation. They did this typically from horseback, armed with a whip and often a gun. However, particularly on larger plantations, the bulk of the actual whipping was done not by the overseer, but by the slave driver, who were in turn themselves slaves. So this shows how the divide and conquer system of social control worked on the plantation itself, with certain slaves placed above others via promotion to elite positions like slave driver or positions within the household. This helped to both limit the solidarity amongst the enslaved by creating like a hierarchy within their ranks, and also facilitated the white plantation management's attempts at information gathering, with enslaved people incentivized alternatively by systems of punishment and of reward to participate in the surveillance of their fellow enslaved people. We can also see this kind of divide and conquer logic at play on the overseer themselves, because overseers primarily consisted of lower class European whites. So this wasn't, the middle class quasi-gentlemen of the old constabulary system in England. Plantation overseers in the colonies were usually working class whites, often from poorer parts of Europe, such as Scotland. And in fact, white Scots were overrepresented within the plantation overseer population, something that we don't talk about, but we really should. And this was because poor whites, which, Scottish people were disproportionately a part of at that time, often had much better prospects of upward social mobility within the context of a slave colony than they did in mainland Europe. Even by virtue of simply moving to a slave society, poor whites ensured that they were no longer at the bottom of the heap, as even if they were poor, at least they were white. But by encouraging poor whites to identify more with their racial position as white rather than their economic position as poor, the system of social control active on plantations helped to protect the interests of the often super rich plantation owner. Even further, the position of the overseer was actually a very senior position within the plantation hierarchy. So if we reconceptualize the slave plantation as a kind of corporation, as historian Caitlin Rosenthal has done, overseers are kind of the duty manager of the plantation. And above them would be only the attorney who handled the plantation's legal affairs and is then more like a kind of, general manager. And then the owner themselves, who in many instances would often be completely absent as much of the planter class didn't live full-time in the colonies. So this proximity to the top of the hierarchy feeds an imagined proximity between the overseer and the planter, with many overseers aspiring to themselves become plantation owners, a jump that was, in reality, rarely, if ever, possible. This, in a way, is the first iteration of the American dream, that poor working-class whites can elevate themselves in society by closely identifying with the dominant economic structure, here plantation-based enslavement, but in later centuries it would be poverty wage-based capitalism, to such an extent that they will join the ranks of the owner or planter class. To put it another way, what I've here called a kind of divide and conquer logic in terms of how it worked on the position of specifically the white working classes, we could call, under a Marxist logic, a system of false consciousness, meaning a system which served to persuade the white working class to identify their own interests with the very economic structure that oppressed them. A similar logic underpinned the foundation of the Met. So in 1822, then Home Secretary Robert Peel established a commission whose objective was the creation of a professional citywide police force in London. This committee produced a report which made a number of recommendations on what this police force should look like, and most of these recommendations focused on the institutional structure of the force. Specifically, it wanted to bring together the amalgamation of micro police forces already operational in the city under the centralized control of the Home Office, so that hierarchy could be created within their ranks. As historian Chris Williams has highlighted, it was via this creation of hierarchy within the police that reformists ensured that individual police officers identified their interests more with the police force than with the civilian population from which they came. Okay, hello, divide and conquer, false consciousness, it's you again. But yes, it was essentially the prospect of promotion and the idea that lower level officers, again, working class whites, could make their way up through the ranks to join the elite political class that governed the police, that secured this ideological buy-in, in much the same way that working class overseers dreamed of making their way into the elite planter class. There was also a very strong focus within the nascent Metropolitan Police on the importance of information gathering. This was something that was stressed by Glasgow-born London magistrate Patrick Colquhoun in his 1796 text, A Treatise on the Policing of the Metropolis, thought by many historians to be a key source of inspiration for the creation of the Met some 30 years later. In his treatise, Colquhoun paints the picture of a London besieged by a growing underclass who, for the most part, and I'm quoting directly here, had depraved habits and loose conduct that threatened, above all, and again quoting directly here, the capital of the British dominions and the nation at large. So the solution that Colquhoun argues for is not so much a police force as it is a police state. So a complete restructuring of society that will serve to discipline and reshape the morality of the lower classes. He actually directly references questions of morality over 200 times in this book, and information gathering on these classes was thus seen as essential. For Colquhoun, the role of the police is no longer to respond to crime that is actively being or has already been committed, as it was under the old constabulary system. The role of the police is now to prevent crime from being committed. In much the same way that the purpose of information gathering by the white management of slave plantations was to prevent revolts by slaves who were in turn legally construed as property, in Colquhoun's police, the purpose of information gathering is to prevent crime, particularly crimes against property. For example, Colquhoun suggests that London's night coachmen should be restructured to be a kind of network of police informants by making it mandatory that all night coachmen operational after midnight are licensed by the police board. Similarly, he suggests that the new London police should surveil night and day the houses of large known traders in stolen goods to deter thieves and burglars from attempting to sell their wares, and thus, in his view, prevent such crimes from occurring in the first place. So that's 2 for 2 so far: hierarchy and information gathering, features that the new Metropolitan Police did have, that the old constabulary system didn't have, but that the colonial system of policing did have. The final element that came to distinguish the modern Met from what came before, that was also borrowed from colonial policing, is the reconceptualization of the police as a kind of paramilitary force. And here the Met was modelled on the ironically named Peace Protection Force, created to assist the continued colonization of Ireland in 1814. So just as a bit of background for those who may be unfamiliar with the system of colonization in Ireland, it was premised on the dispossessing of Irish Catholic peasants of their land and making them pay rents to primarily English and Scottish Protestant landlords. These rents were most often paid through the sale of high-value grains like oats and barley, referred to as money crops, which were in turn exported to the British mainland, leaving Irish peasants reliant on potatoes for food, a low-value crop that could grow even on rocky terrain. This, of course, meant that Irish peasants were incredibly vulnerable to any failures in the potato crops, since colonial landlords in Ireland not only continued to insist on the payment of rent in years of crop failure, but frequently increased the rents, leading to a number of famines, ultimately culminating infamously in the Great Famine of 1845, which killed around a quarter of the Irish population, essentially through colonially mandated starvation. And it's about 30 years before the Great Famine that the Peace Protection Force are created by the British government in Ireland to help quell rebellion from nationalist Irish groups and ensure that the British Crown was able to continue extracting both rent and mandatory grain exports from Irish peasants. The Peace Protection Force was essentially a completely militarized police force, often staffed by British ex-military, that was deployed to specific areas in Ireland where local magistrates had requested their presence in order to reassert colonial law and order. And it's here that we get the real commonality between the Peace Protection Force in Ireland and its successor, the Metropolitan Police. Not only were the PPF a militarized police force, but their actions were given like the veneer of acceptability by appearing to constitute a form of policing by consent, since the magistrates had to request their presence. Although, of course, the consent did not come from the Irish peasant class, but rather the Irish upper class from which the magistrates hailed. This same emphasis on the veneer of consent was central to the so-called core principles of the Metropolitan Police, as laid out in the Metropolitan Policing Act of 1829. So, when the Met was formally established some 15 years later, they essentially constituted a watered-down model of the PPF. There was awareness that a visibly militarized standing presence in English cities would draw criticism, and so there were like these conscious attempts to differentiate the uniforms of the Met Police from military officials, such as by giving them like top hats and tailcoats. They also were not armed with guns, as the PPF were. Instead, they carried truncheons. However, the similarities were not lost on the British public at the time, with one Weekly Dispatch article decrying these quote-unquote military protectors of our civil liberties, and a monthly magazine article labeling the Met as a quote military retainer of the Duke of Wellington. But here's the crucial bit, right? It's not just that the new Met's, structures of hierarchy, applications of divide and rule, and information gathering tactics and militarized approach had a similar vibe to policing in Ireland, albeit in a more watered down format to make it palatable to the English population. It's that the people involved in coming up with these ideas were directly involved in these colonization efforts. So Patrick Colquhoun, whose treatise on the policing of the metropolis that I quoted from earlier, was directly involved in the system of human enslavement in the Americas and the Caribbean. So when he was 15, Colquhoun had emigrated to the slave colony of Virginia, What exactly he did while he was there is unclear, but what is clear is that by the time he returned to the UK, he had created a number of connections with slave plantations, which allowed him to establish a lucrative import-export business on his return to the UK, trading in the commodities produced by enslaved people in Virginia. But it goes even further than this. Colquhoun was the formal representative of the West Indian slave planter interest in London and actively lobbied the government to protect these interests throughout his lifetime. In fact, his entire reason in calling for the establishment of a former police force in London was to protect the goods of the slavers that were being looted in London ports. Similarly, it was one guy who was responsible for creating both the Colonial Police Protection Force in Ireland and the London Metropolitan Police. And that man is former UK Secretary of Ireland turned Home Secretary turned Prime Minister, who I mentioned earlier, A1 Robert Peel. These two men were both intimately acquainted with and directly involved with policing systems in the colonies, and they imported this learning to be applied within the UK. And here's the final caveat of this section, right? I'm not trying to say that the white British working class were policed with the same brutality that Irish peasants and black enslaved labourers were. These systems had to be watered down in order to be palatable enough for the British public. However, we also have to remember that not everyone in Britain at this time was white. And when it comes to groups living in Britain who were racialized to this level of subhuman, I would say that the treatment that they received at the hands of the Met was just as brutal. And we see echoes of this legacy also today, where the burden of colonially inspired police brutality, both here and in places like the United States, who in the mid-1800s imported almost wholesale the Met Police model, falls much harder on some groups than others. So when people say that the police are institutionally racist, this is why that is, right? This is the history that this system comes from. Right, that was a lot of history. So if you're still here with me, thanks very much for sticking with it. Now we're going to change speeds a bit. So I want to jump forward in time and talk about the application and impact of policing today. So I think we all know by now that modern day policing is deeply inegalitarian in its impact. Perhaps the most famous example of this is in the war on drugs and the racial and economic biases which are baked into which communities are policed for their drug use. But also, I think that this topic has been covered pretty extensively by others and very well. So, it's a much more common example and we're all by this stage pretty familiar with it. So I'm actually not going to talk about drugs here. Instead, I'm going to focus on 3 areas that are much less discussed in the debate on policing today. And these areas are the policing of mental illness, homelessness, and education. So let's start with mental illness first. This is an area where we have seen an increasing involvement of police response, particularly in recent years in the UK since the onset of austerity. Nowadays, police are regularly expected to act as frontline responders to mental health emergencies. In large part, this is because of the immense pressure on other public services that are traditionally supposed to address mental health, like community mental health teams, hospitals, and the ambulance service. In 2022, for example, Police Scotland dealt with 23,259 mental health incidents, which is almost double what they were dealing with 5 years prior in 2017, when police were involved in 12,775 mental health incidents. Now, why is this so troubling? So looking specifically at Scotland, under the Mental Health Care and Treatment Act Scotland of 2003, police have the power to remove any person to a place of safety who the police officer suspects to have a mental disorder and are in immediate need of treatment. Already, this causes some huge problems. Firstly, a police station is classed under the Act as an acceptable place of safety, meaning essentially that you can just be held in the cells for appearing mentally ill. The guidance for the Act does specify that this should be a last resort, but given the strain on mental health services, I do question how often this seems like a reasonable thing to resort to. How often are police officers, justifiably or not, concluding, well, it's the cells or nowhere? Secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, what in fact qualifies a police officer, and it's not specified that they need to have any specific training in mental health, this can be any officer, what qualifies them to make a diagnosis of a mental disorder? Now, again, you might think I'm just being a bit hysterical here. You know, if there's like a guy running around the streets of Glasgow in his underwear waving a knife around, you're probably pretty safe to assume that there's something like going on there mentally. You don't need some kind of psychiatric degree to ascertain that. And yeah, like that's a good point, right? I'm sure that there is a lot of cases where police officers are making these judgment calls and they're pretty much like right on the money. However, we live in a society, right? You know, we didn't just fall out of a coconut tree. We live in the context of all that has come before and all that will come after, yada, 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 which means all of our judgments are in some way influenced by our socialization. Now, an independent review of the Mental Health Act in England, which is substantively similar to the Scottish Act, found that Black people were 4 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act than white people. Similarly, in Scotland, an independent review from 2021 found that people from the lowest socioeconomic brackets were more likely than their more affluent counterparts to be detained under the Mental Health Act. There was also a racial dynamic to this, with Black, Asian, and other ethnic minorities all being more likely to be detained and more likely to be classed as a risk to themselves or others than their white Scottish counterparts. This difference was particularly strong for Black women compared to white Scottish women. And the reason that this is like so important is because being classed as a risk to yourself or others allows the state to detain you for much longer. So initially, the police can detain you for 24 hours inside the police station itself. Within those 24 hours, they can have you assessed by a doctor who may decide that you need medical treatment, at which point they can issue an emergency detention certificate, which allows you to be detained in a hospital for a further 72 hours. Under the emergency detention guidance, you should be transferred to a hospital within 72 hours of this assessment, but this means that you can, in theory, be held inside a police station for up to 4 days, having committed no crimes other than being apparently mentally ill, before you enter a healthcare establishment where you will be detained for a further 72 hours from arrival, so like 1 week in total. You may also be reassessed once you enter the hospital to see if a longer treatment period is necessary. Now, like, quick little thought experiment here. Do you think that being held in a police station involuntarily for 4 days is going to increase or decrease your levels of mental distress? Do you think that you would be arriving at that mental health assessment more or less likely to come across as mentally ill? And again, stressing the point that all of this is pipeline into medical detention is more likely to happen to you in Scotland if you are poor and or an ethnic minority. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, a police response to mental illness is like never appropriate. There may be cases where it is, but what I am saying is that in a context wherein mental health services are virtually non-existent, and where they do exist, they are piecemeal, short-term, and shrouded behind incredibly long wait lists. Far from being an exceptional or last resort power of the police, this is becoming an increasingly common route into the mental health system. Both in England and in Scotland, the number of police detentions made under the respective mental health acts has increased significantly since the onset of austerity and continues to rise every year. This may be explained by like an underlying rise in mental illness, like particularly since the pandemic, where rates of everything from anxiety and depression to like psychosis and paranoid schizophrenia are recorded to be on the rise. But even if that is the case, it's still right to question whether increasing police involvement in the mental health response will do anything to address the underlying rates of mental illness. So that's one thing, right? Now, homelessness. So homeless people in the UK and elsewhere are much more likely to come into contact with the police because of the criminalisation of homeless associated behaviours. For example, public urination is criminalised across the UK, and if you're rough sleeping and all the public toilets have been shut down due to lack of public funding, where the fuck else are you going to go? Generally, in the UK, if you are caught urinating by the police, you will be issued with a fine. And if you do not pay your fine, you may be imprisoned. Homelessness has also been criminalised in very explicit ways. In England, both rough sleeping and begging were illegal under the Vagrancy Act of 1824. This was very recently repealed and replaced by the outgoing Conservative government with the 2024 Criminal Justice Bill. But critics of the bill have highlighted that it is not much more sympathetic to homeless people, particularly not to those from traveller communities, and in effect still criminalises rough sleeping and begging. In Scotland, rough sleeping is not illegal, and begging isn't illegal unless it is deemed to be aggressive, threatening, abusive, or a breach of the peace by police officers. But this might raise some issues with police discretion. How are they classifying threatening behaviours? Is their classification justified and proportionate, etc., etc.? The issue is that we just don't know because Police Scotland don't release any data on this. And this will be a recurring theme when it comes to Police Scotland. They are very shit at releasing data. Additionally, if you are homeless, you are both statistically more likely to face substance misuse issues and, especially for rough sleepers, you are more visible to the police and so are more likely to get caught. This in turn can lead to further convictions for drug-related offences, which is likely to push you even further into homelessness because criminal convictions will limit your ability to find work if you don't already have it and to find housing, particularly on the private rental market. This kind of revolving door between prisons and homelessness is something that was explicitly recognised in one of the only government sources I could find on the economic cost of homelessness to the state. This was an analysis conducted by the UK Government Department for Communities and Local Government in 2012, which found that not only were formerly homeless people overrepresented in the UK prison population, with 15% of prisoners in 2012 reporting being homeless prior to incarceration compared with just 3% of UK society as a whole, but also that reoffending, or what policymakers call recidivism rates, were much higher for these prisoners upon release. So, 79% of prisoners who reported being homeless prior to being incarcerated went on to be convicted of a further crime within 12 months of release. In that same year, the recidivism rate, i.e. how many people were reconvicted of a further crime within 12 months, for the general prison population was 25.3%. So for 2012, prisoners who had experienced homelessness were over 3 times more likely than other prisoners to be sent back to jail within a year of release. This same report estimated that the total cost to the British state per homeless person per year in terms of benefit payments, health services, visits to A&E, temporary accommodation, interactions with the justice system, etc., was between £24,000 and £30,000 a year, more than other non-homeless citizens, right? So that's in excess of what the state pays for the average person. These figures will likely underestimate the cost of homelessness to the British state for some individuals. The report stated that each individual drug conviction cost the British state £16,000 to administer, and shoplifting convictions cost £3,500 to administer. So if somebody is convicted multiple times of drug or shoplifting offences, as may well be the case within the homeless population, we can see how these costs very quickly balloon. To put this into perspective, in that year, the bang average British salary, right? So the median British income, literally the middle income in Britain, if you were to line them all up in a row, was £26,500 a year. So the equivalent of a middle class salary was being spent per person per year on an ineffective, costly and cruel system which did little to address the underlying issue of homelessness. And realistically, until more social housing is built, all of that is very unlikely to change. And again, this is not to say that, police interaction with homeless individuals is never merited. Maybe there are legitimate cases where intervention is necessary in the interests of public safety, and maybe the police are the best positioned to intervene in those cases. However, we should ask, how much more value for money could we achieve if instead of pumping all of this money into police budgets, we pumped more money into building social housing and preventing people becoming homeless in the first place? This would decrease the strain not only on the police, courts, and prisons, but also to all public services where homeless people are more likely to present more frequently with more complex needs and thus require more resource and attention. A 2015 study by the University of York made exactly this conclusion when they presented 4 scenarios of homelessness in the UK, devised from 165 qualitative interviews with homeless individuals. They found that in each of these 4 scenarios, those 4 common types of homelessness, the cost to the British taxpayer of preventing that individual from becoming homeless in the first place would always have been lower than the cost of the services they would require if allowed to remain homeless for a period of 1 year. A third area where we can see the inegalitarian impact of modern policing is in the policing of education. So over the last 20 years, a police-based response to behavioural issues in schools has become increasingly normalised and has served to further intensify the over-policing of underprivileged communities, ensuring that first contact with the police state apparatus begins at an increasingly younger age for these marginalised groups. So we can see this particularly clearly in the United States, where the rollout of campus officers has turned many schools, particularly those serving poor and Black communities, into prison-like establishments where students are frequently arrested and even violently assaulted by police officers for minor behavioural infractions like using their phone in class, disrespecting teachers, and getting into loud arguments. According to a lawsuit submitted by the Southern Poverty Law Center in the United States, between the years 2006 and 2014, police officers deployed in schools in Birmingham, Alabama, used a combination pepper spray and tear gas agent called Freeze Plus P, side effects of which include extreme pain, skin irritation, and trouble breathing, on over 199 students, all of whom were Black. Similarly, in 2015, the 17-year-old student of a high school in Texas had to spend 52 days in a medically induced coma after being tasered by the campus officer while trying to break up a fight by other students. This kind of violence has become very routine in American schools because police officers based in these schools are actively encouraged to view themselves as a paramilitary force, defending the wider student population from the imagined, dangerous villain hidden amongst them. A big part of the reason why this is the case is because school resource officers, as campus cops are euphemistically called, constitute a huge market for military contractors who actively court their custom in order to sell them weapons. I'll quote now from the keynote address given by a so-called counterterrorism expert at the 2007 conference for the National Association of School Resource Officers. You've got people in your schools right now planning a Columbine. Every town, every university has a show. This is the Virginia Tech shooter. And in every state, we have Al-Qaeda cells. Thinking of it. Every school is a possible target of attack. You've got to be a one-man fighting force. You've got to have enough guns and ammunition and body armor to stay alive. You should be walking around in school every day in complete tactical equipment with semi-automatic weapons and 5 rounds of ammo. You can no longer afford to think of yourselves as peace officers. You must think of yourselves as soldiers at war because we're going to ask you to act like soldiers. In Scotland and the wider UK, police and schools have not been so associated with this kind of paramilitary mentality, in part because the police in general are less heavily armed here, but also because we don't actually know what police in schools here do. In Scotland, there is no regular reporting on the role or number of police officers in schools. The only 2 sources of information that I could find was a Scottish Government evaluation of campus officers conducted in 2010, so now at time of recording 14 years out of date, and a government response to a Freedom of Information request submitted in 2020. Now, I'm not suggesting the police officers in Scottish schools are perpetrating the kind of extreme violence that we hear about in the United States. I think that would at the very least be picked up by the news, even if there wasn't any active monitoring of it by government bodies. However, I do find it concerning that the number of campus officers in Scottish schools has increased from a reported 55 in 2010 to 87 in 2020. So that's a 58% increase without any real transparency on what it is that these officers are supposed to be doing or why so many of them are now required. Campus officers in the UK were initially brought in under New Labour in 2002. So this is, really the age of the ASBO, right? ASBOs being antisocial behaviour orders that were brought in under Tony Blair in 1998. And ASBOs have since been widely criticised as a criminalisation of the working class with punishable offences, including minor infractions, if you even want to call them that, like spitting in the street, which, is disgusting, right? But a criminal offense, a valuable use of police resource, probably fucking not, right? It also included very vague infractions like loitering. Now, what does that mean? Just being in a public space. And we have to remember that at the time there was this kind of media hysteria around hoodies and tracksuits, and while those things are kind of fetishized by the middle class now, who have co-opted this traditionally working class style, at that time, walking around in a fucking Fred Perry tracksuit was enough to single you out as a target for police scrutiny. And all of this, right, the ASBOs, the hysteria around hoodies and tracksuits, etc., all of this was ideologically underpinned by the deeply conservative criminological theory of broken windows policing. So broken windows theory was first put about by right-wing criminologists James Q. Wilson and George L. Kelling in 1982. And it was a theory of crime that used the metaphor of neighborhoods with broken windows to argue that a lack of routine monitoring and social signaling that crime is unacceptable will itself lead to more crime. So the argument is that, if you're in a neighborhood and somebody smashes a window, if that window is not quickly repaired, then this will signal to other potential vandals that there are no consequences for the smashing of windows, and they will then go on to smash more windows. And this in turn will lead to more serious kinds of crime being perpetrated because the environment is signaling that behavior in general is not monitored and criminal behavior specifically is tolerated. The consequences of this theory for policing cannot be overstated because it essentially told police that even minor social faux pas, like spitting in the street, could be linked to through this inevitable chain of events to serious crime if allowed to continue unchecked. So essentially it told police that crime prevention is no longer just about intervening in instances of actual crimes like stopping a burglary. It's now about monitoring and policing the social behavior of civilians. So is anyone getting a very strong Patrick Colquhoun vibe here? All we got to do is switch the word antisocial behavior for public morality, and we're right back in the 1800s. And when this broken public moral window theory is applied to society in 2002, to a society that was already deeply classist, which civilians do we think were targeted the most for this kind of scrutiny? So it's no coincidence that the police are introduced to schools during the era of broken windows policing, ASBOs, tracksuit hysteria, etc., when we consider which schools they are being put into. So in Glasgow alone, 25 out of 30 high schools had a dedicated police presence, Glasgow being one of the poorest school districts in the country. Even further, has anyone ever heard of a campus officer being stationed in a private school? There is a complete lack of transparency about how campus officers work in Scotland, like where they're deployed and what their roles are. But anecdotally, and forgive me for that, I did ask a couple of friends who were privately educated in Scotland, and none of them had ever heard of a campus officer stationed in a private school either. So if this is something that is supposed to be so good for young people's development, right? Would you not think that private schools who are supposed to provide the very best that money can buy for their young people would also have campus officers? And if not, why not? Ostensibly, campus officers were brought in to reduce truancy and address behavioural problems in schools. But Private schools also have truancy and behavioral issues. Why is a police response not suitable for the privately educated students? Is it because there is a tacit recognition that the police are an overly punitive force to be dealing with teenagers? Is it because there is an assumption which is applied only to privately educated students that the behavioral issues that they display in adolescence will not lead to serious crime in later life? If so, why is that same assumption not applied to students in state schools? What can we call this other than the criminalization of working class kids? Finally, and last point on this, let's consider how these officers are funded. Now, you might not agree with me, you might not see any inherent problems with stationing police officers in state schools. You might argue that working class kids are also at a higher risk of becoming victims of crime, and so stationing police in those schools is totally appropriate to protect them from victimization. Okay, fair. Let's talk about who pays for these officers. Now, again, there is no regular reporting on this. The only source of information we have is the response to a Freedom of Information request published by the Educational Institute of Scotland in 2018. This response stated that while a major part of the funding, they don't specify how major, is provided by Police Scotland from their budget, there are also 3 areas in Scotland where campus police are paid for, at least in part, by the Public Equity Fund, a fund that is supposed to address poverty-related educational attainment gaps. Now, please explain to me how exactly having a police officer on campus is going to help a working class kid get better grades in, say, maths, right? If that money is to address educational attainment gaps, would it not be better spent on, say, a tutoring program than a police officer? On someone like actually trained in education, maybe. The 2010 evaluation from the Scottish Government provided some slightly more concrete figures, so it's like 8 years earlier, but a bit more concrete, placing the cost of police presence in schools, which at the time was actually like a much smaller presence, at £2 million per year. Now, this is just like the salary costs. This is just what it costed to pay the salary of the 55 officers who were stationed at that time. It doesn't include any other costs that may be incurred from their presence in schools, so like resources, training, expenses, etc. All of that is not included. Of these salary costs in 2010, 64% was picked up by Police Scotland, but 30% was picked up by local councils and 6% was picked up by the Fairer Scotland Fund. So that is £720,000 per year of non-police budget that was going to pay the wages of police officers in schools rather than being spent on actual education. And this was 13 years ago when there were 58% less police officers in Scotland. So fuck knows what those figures are now. Even if all those police officers are like lovely people, right? They're great at their jobs. They don't commit any acts of violence against the kids. They don't arrest any of the kids and steer them into this like prison pipeline, whatever, right? That money could still be better spent on people who are actually specifically qualified to A, work with children, and B, deliver education. All right. So, to sum us up, since we've covered quite a lot of ground today, broadly, the show has been split into 2 parts. So in the first half, we spoke about this like troubling history that underpins modern day policing and how it's rooted in theories of social control that were born from classism, racism, and colonialism. In the second half of the show, I've taken you on a bit of a like whistle-stop tour of some of the less analysed areas of police injustice that exist today, namely the encroachment of policing-based responses in the areas of mental illness, homelessness, and education. Now, to finish off, I want you to cast your minds back to the coronation of King Charles in May 2023. So, the much obviously beloved Met Police were out in full force to peacefully facilitate the crowning of our new king, and by that I mean they were there to arrest civilians for being in possession of the following items: bits of cardboard, rape alarms, and zip ties. In total, 64 people were reported to have been arrested on Saturday, May the 6th, and 52 of these were arrested explicitly for suspicion that they would attempt to disrupt the royal procession. In the days that followed, several viral videos circulated on social media showing the arrest of 6 protesters from the protest group Republic as they unloaded placards from a van. It initially appeared that they were being arrested for participating in an unlawful protest, but it was later reported that this group had actually engaged with the Met Police's so-called protest liaison team ahead of the event, meaning that, despite very clearly being an organized protest group, they've made the placards, they have the t-shirts, they have the van, all that good, logistical stuff, none of which, screams guerrilla warfare tactics, right? And even though this group had actively tried to coordinate with the police, to let them know to expect their presence, etc., by all accounts doing everything by the fucking book, they were still arrested. In this instance, the Met used the new Public Order Act, which conveniently received royal assent just 4 days before the coronation, to justify this clampdown on civil right to protest as a protection against so-called public nuisance. In one clip I saw broadcast on Sky News, a Met officer was filmed saying, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, that people identified as potential protesters were arrested because people had come from across the country to, quote unquote, enjoy the celebration in peace. Which I think is pretty revealing, right? Because presumably these protesters had also come from across the country to exercise their democratic right to protest. I think that this very clearly shows how within the policing mentality, there is this ideological construction of those who are, the people to be protected, and those who are the groups that are outside of the people that we must be protected from. This is really the overarching point that I've been trying to make throughout the show. The police are not your pals, and the extent to which they will protect you is completely dependent on the extent to which they view you as being within the people, a category which is itself constructed based on the ideological underpinnings of the police: racism, classism, sexism, and colonialism. To finalize this point, I want to talk briefly about a painting called Eviction Scene by Irish artist Daniel MacDonald. So it was painted in 1850. So just at the tail end of the Great Irish Famine, and it shows Irish peasants being forcibly evicted from their homes by Irish police officers, whilst two visibly wealthy landlords, presumably English, stand over them. And it is a testament to the role of the police in upholding not only the system of exploitative rent-seeking by landlords in Ireland, which we spoke about already in the show, but also to the wider colonisation project as a whole. This painting was recently in the news again because it was kind of remixed in 2023 by Dublin-based artist Spicebag, who superimposed a photograph of masked Irish Gardaí and private security officers forcibly evicting tenants from their home on Dublin's Frederick Street in 2018. I think that the continuing relevance of this image really shows just how direct the through lines have been from the police's colonizer origins to their current role in society, something which we can likely expect to see more of in years to come with the renewed deepening of the social control function of the police through bills like the Public Order Act. Right, that's all from me today, folks. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the show. Remember, you can listen back to any other episodes on all major podcasting platforms and on YouTube. And if you really enjoyed the show, please consider supporting us, once again, with money on patreon.com/militantempathy. Be good to each other. Friends forever. Absolutely no take backs. Okay, right. Love you. Bye.